My heart belongs to another, the Duke told her after 11 years of arranged marriage. My heart belongs to another, Emmeline. The clock in the library had been ticking for 11 years. Emmeline had long since stopped hearing it. It was simply part of the house, part of the particular grammar of Alvingham Park, like the way the third stair creaked, or the smell of wood smoke and old paper that lived in the east corridor, or the sound of Gideon's pen scratching through the morning's correspondence while she read beside the window with her tea going cold in its cup. It was a Tuesday in October, and everything about it was ordinary, until it wasn't. She had known something was different the moment she came in. Gideon was standing rather than sitting, which was unusual. He was looking at the fire rather than his papers, which was more unusual still. And he had not reached for his tea, which had been sitting on the tray for 7 minutes. In 11 years of mornings, Emmeline had never known Gideon to ignore his tea. "Sit down," he said, when she entered. "I generally sit down in the library," Emmeline said. "It is where the chairs are." But she sat, and she looked at him, and she waited. Gideon turned from the fire. He was a handsome man. She had always known this the way one knows a fact that has no particular bearing on daily life, with the kind of fine-boned, serious face that looked better at 40 than it had at 29, when they had stood together in a church and agreed, with great formality and very little feeling, to share a name and an estate. He looked uncomfortable now, which was also unusual. Gideon was almost never uncomfortable. He was the most composed person she had ever met, comfortable in parliamentary chambers and royal drawing rooms with equal ease. He was not comfortable now. "Emmeline," he said, "I have to tell you something." She waited. "Lady Sarah Leland has returned to London." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Emmeline watched the rings move outward from it. She knew the name. Every person in their circle knew the name, though it had not been spoken aloud in the 11 years of their marriage, at least not in her presence. Lady Sarah Leland, now Lady Sarah Holt, then newly widowed, had been the great romance of Gideon's youth, before the pragmatic arrangements of family and inheritance had intervened and deposited Emmeline in her place instead. "I see," Emmeline said. "She has been widowed," Gideon said. "For 14 months now." He looked at her steadily. "I feel it is only right to be honest with you. My heart belongs to another, Emmeline. It always has. I thought you should hear that directly, from me, rather than through the season's gossip." The clock ticked. Emmeline looked at her husband, at the man she had shared breakfast with for 4,000 mornings, whose handwriting she could distinguish from across a room, whose dry laugh she could hear through 2 closed doors, whose habits and preferences and particular silences she knew as well as she knew her own, and waited to feel what she was supposed to feel. What she felt, in the first honest moment, was a small, sharp sting. Followed by something more complicated and less comfortable. Followed, underneath both of those, by a very specific and inconvenient clarity. What she said was, "Lady Sarah Leland. The woman who cried because a butterfly landed on her bonnet in 1768. Gideon blinked. "I remember distinctly," Emmeline continued, "because it was the Harrington garden party and the butterfly was entirely inoffensive and she carried on for 20 minutes as though it had committed a personal assault." Gideon. She looked at him with the expression she used when his estate reports contained errors that should have been obvious before they reached her. "You are one of the most intelligent men I have ever met. Your taste in women is absolutely catastrophic." Gideon stared at her. In 11 years, Emmeline thought, he had never looked at her with quite that expression. She was not entirely certain what it contained. Surprise, certainly. Something else she did not immediately have a name for. "I expected," he began. "Tears," Emmeline said. "I am sure you did. I am sorry to disappoint you. I am thinking rather clearly at the moment, which is inconveniently characteristic of me." She picked up her tea, found it cold, and set it back down. "I assume you want to pursue this properly, which means we will need to maintain appearances through the season, and then arrange a quiet separation that satisfies the legal requirements without producing excessive scandal." Gideon was still looking at her strangely. "You are being very practical," she said. "Yes. I have always been practical. It is, I suspect, the quality that made me useful as a wife and unremarkable as a romantic prospect." The words came out more clearly than she had intended, with a small sharp edge she had not meant to expose. She smoothed her expression. We are in agreement, then. Through the season. Normal appearances. After that, we will determine the appropriate arrangement. Emmeline. I have the Harwick correspondence to finish this morning, she said, standing. And your estate manager is coming at 11. I have prepared the quarterly figures. They are on your desk. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. For what it is worth, Gideon, and I recognize you did not ask, the woman who cried about the butterfly is going to bore you to absolute ruin within a fortnight. She looked at him over her shoulder. I say that not from jealousy, but from 11 years of watching you run out of patience with tedium. You will see it yourself. She went out. The door closed quietly behind her. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden beauty and unexpected love, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories where pain shatters and true character shines through. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and your presence makes these stories come alive. Emmeline stood in the east corridor for a moment, with the smell of wood smoke around her and the sound of the clock through the wall, and pressed her hand briefly to her sternum. There was the sting again. Sharper this time, without the necessity of performance to manage it. She acknowledged it with the same honest discipline she applied to everything, named it for what it was, and filed it in the category of facts that required no immediate action. Then she went to finish the Harwick correspondence, because the tenants needed their letters, and the estate did not pause for anyone's complications, and Emmeline had never in her life failed to do what needed to be done. Chapter 2. Lady Sarah Holt was everything Gideon had remembered, which was the problem. He had spent 11 years carrying a very specific image, Sarah at 22, golden and laughing, the girl he had been certain was the only woman he would ever love, taken away by his father's demands and the cold mathematics of inheritance. He had preserved her in amber, unchanged and perfect, as people preserve the things they cannot have. The reality, introduced at the Whitmore ball in the second week of November, was considerably more complicated. She was still beautiful. He could not honestly say otherwise. But beauty, he was discovering, occupied a room differently at 33 than it had at 22, particularly when it knew itself very well and expected considerable accommodation. She required her rap fetched. She found the music too loud, then not loud enough. She made observations about the other women in the room with a sweet, precise cruelty that she seemed genuinely unaware of as cruelty. Gideon smiled and attended and felt, with growing unease, like a man performing a role he had rehearsed for a play that had been running much longer than he was comfortable with. He kept finding his eyes moving across the room. Emmeline was there, because the season required them both to be there, and she moved through the ballroom with the particular ease of a woman who had made her peace with large social occasions and no longer needed anything from them. She talked to people she genuinely liked. She laughed at things she actually found funny. She extracted herself from conversations that bored her with a gracious efficiency that Gideon had always privately admired. At one point she caught him looking, across the full width of the Whitmore ballroom, and raised one eyebrow a single, measured degree. It was the expression she used when something predictable had occurred. He looked away. He heard, distantly, the sound of Sarah explaining that the floral arrangements were not quite right. At the Delmore dinner party 3 days later, he sat at the wrong end of the table from Emmeline for the first time in several years, because the dinner had been organized by people who did not know their marriage was currently in the process of dissolving, and had seated them separately to encourage variety of conversation. Gideon was seated beside Sarah. The meat course arrived. Sarah looked at her plate with the expression of a woman confronting an administrative difficulty. Gideon, she said sweetly, would you? My wrists are simply too delicate this evening. The cold affects them terribly. He looked at her. Then he looked at her plate. Then he looked, with absolute involuntary precision, down the length of the table to where Emmeline sat between Lord Ashworth and the elderly Countess of March. Emmeline had observed the entire exchange. She lifted her wine glass a single deliberate inch in his direction, her face composed in an expression of the purest, most private amusement. Gideon looked back at Sarah's plate. He cut her meat. He did it without expression, with the smooth social autopilot of a man raised to manage difficult situations with composure. But somewhere in the process, a realization settled over him with the quiet weight of something that had been obvious for a long time and was only now becoming visible. With Sarah, he was performing. Every word, every gesture, every carefully measured romantic expression was a production, the heroic Duke, the faithful lover, the man she had always believed she deserved. It required constant vigilance. He could not be cynical. He could not be tired. He could not murmur anything genuinely uncharitable about the terrible quality of the Delmore punch, which was, objectively, the worst punch he had consumed in a decade of dinner parties. With Emmeline, for 11 years, he had not been performing anything. He thought about the morning teas, and the estate reports, and the particular quality of the comfortable silence they maintained in the library when they were both reading and neither of them felt any obligation to fill it. He thought about her dry commentary on parliamentary gossip, delivered with perfect timing and minimal expression. He thought about the evening she had stayed up until 2 in the morning helping him draft a letter to the Home Office on behalf of their tenant farmers, and had made him eat something because he had forgotten dinner, and had not made anything of it at all. He thought about what she had said in the corridor, a good husband to this estate, and a kind companion to me. Kind companion. He turned the phrase over in his mind like a man examining a document he had signed without reading carefully enough, beginning to understand, at considerable distance from the original moment, exactly what it contained. Across the table, Emmeline laughed at something the elderly countess said, a genuine laugh, brief and unguarded. Gideon watched her, with the specific quality of attention one brings to something one has been looking at for 11 years without actually seeing it. Then Sarah said his name, and he looked back, and cut another piece of meat, and told himself that he was simply tired. He told himself this with the diminishing conviction of a man who was becoming aware, gradually and against his preferences, that tiredness was not the problem. Chapter 3. The letter arrived from Alvingham Park on a Wednesday, the head tenant farmer, Mr. Costigan, reporting a fever moving through 3 of the western cottages, and water in the lower fields from 4 days of steady rain. They travelled north on Thursday. Emmeline did not speak much on the journey, which suited Gideon, because he was not certain what he wanted to say and had been finding, increasingly, that silence with Emmeline was the only honest option available to him. She read most of the way, occasionally making notes in the small leather book she carried in her bag, and when they arrived at the estate in the early evening she was already organising her thoughts in the specific, forward-moving way she had that he had always found quietly remarkable. By 8 o'clock she had spoken with the estate physician, established which families required immediate medical support, identified the 2 cottages with the worst water damage, and arranged for food and dry fuel to be distributed to the affected tenants. Gideon worked beside her, handling the correspondence and the logistics, but he was aware that the centre of gravity in the operation was Emmeline, her calm, her competence, the particular way the tenants looked at her when she came to their doors, like something reliable arriving in a difficult moment. She had rolled her sleeves back. This detail should not have struck him, but it did. There was something about it, about the fine silk pushed up past her wrists, about the total absence of any concern for the state of her dress, about the way she crouched beside old Mrs. Costigan and talked to her at eye level without any of the patronizing softness that well-bred women often performed for the poor, that arrived in his chest like something he did not have an immediate word for. They finished after midnight. The house was quiet. Most of the staff had gone to bed, and the fire in the estate sitting room had burned down to embers. Gideon was sitting in the armchair nearest the grate, too tired to move, when Emmeline came in with a candle and set it on the mantelpiece and dropped into the chair across from him with the exhausted, unglamorous relief of someone who had been on their feet for 8 hours. "Costigan's youngest will be all right," she said. "The physician is confident." "Good," Gideon said. "The lower field drains should have been cleared in September. I have written a note for the estate manager. I saw it on the table." They sat in the thin warmth of the low fire, and the house breathed around them, settling in the dark. "Emmeline," he said. "Don't thank me," she said, without sharpness. "Not for this." "Why not?" She looked at the fire. In the low, uneven light she looked tired, and real, and nothing like performance, and Gideon thought that he had been looking at her face for 11 years and could not, at this precise moment, think of a single face he would rather look at. "Because if you thank me," she said quietly, "it becomes a transaction." And this was not a transaction. She was still looking at the fire. "I did it for the people here. I have known Mrs. Costigan for 11 years. I have watched that youngest child grow from an infant." She paused. "And I did it for you. Because despite your foolish heart, Gideon, you have been a good husband to this estate. And a kind companion to me. There it was again. The same phrase. He heard it differently this time. Emmeline, he started. You should sleep, she said. There is more to do tomorrow. But he did not move, and neither did she, and the fire cracked and settled, and the distance between their two chairs was not a large distance. He reached across and put his hand over hers. He had done this 1,000 times, at formal dinners, at events requiring the appearance of a united couple, with the practiced ease of 11 years of performance. He knew the weight of her hand. He knew exactly how she would adjust her fingers in automatic response. What he had not known, what arrived now with a clarity so sharp it was almost physical, was that she would go very still. Not the stillness of comfort. The stillness of someone making a decision, very quickly, in a difficult moment. She looked down at their hands. Then she looked at him. Her expression was something he had not seen before on Emmeline's face, which was extraordinary given that he had been watching it for 11 years. It was unguarded in a way she almost never allowed, and beneath the exhaustion and the firelight there was something else, something that looked like feeling, real and uninvited and frightening to its owner. Then she stood. Good night, Gideon, she said. Her voice was steady. She picked up the candle and she left, and the sitting room was dark and considerably colder without her in it, and Gideon sat for a long time with his hand still resting on the arm of her empty chair. He was thinking about 11 years. About the particular, specific, unrepeatable 11 years of this marriage, the tea every morning, and the estate reports, and the dinner parties, and the corridor outside the library where she had told him his taste in women was catastrophic. He was thinking about the fact that he had spent 11 years in the company of someone who kept everything running and made it look effortless and had never, not once, required him to be anything other than exactly what he was. He was thinking that if that was what he had taken for granted, then he was considerably more foolish than even Emmeline had given him credit for. Chapter 4. London was exactly as they had left it, which was to say, relentless. Emmeline attended the necessary events. She was charming, and composed, and gave absolutely nothing away, and at home she was perfectly pleasant and completely distant in a way that had no obvious breach Gideon could point to, but that felt, every morning over the tea tray, like standing on the wrong side of a closed window. She had been doing it since they returned from Alvingham Park. He noticed it with the acute, helpless attention of a man who had spent years taking something for granted and was now cataloguing every small absence where it used to be. The commentary was gone, the dry, sideways observations that had been the private grammar of their mornings. She answered his questions. She was never unkind. She was simply not there in the way she had always been there, and the difference was enormous and daily. Then Lord Benedict Ashford appeared. Gideon had known Benedict for years, liked him, even, in the abstract way one likes men who are intelligent and well-mannered and not a direct competitor for anything one values. He had not, until now, had occasion to revise this opinion. Benedict had called twice at the house, openly and correctly, to take Emmeline driving in the park on both occasions and to attend the Hartwell lecture series on natural philosophy, which Emmeline had apparently been wanting to attend for 2 years without a convenient companion. Gideon had no standing to object to any of this. He was, on paper, in the process of separating from Emmeline. He had asked for his freedom. She was simply arranging the reality of her life accordingly. He was living in absolute hell. He was at the Forsyth evening party when he watched Benedict drape Emmeline's shawl around her shoulders, a perfectly ordinary, perfectly decent gesture, offered with the quiet ease of a man paying attention to the people near him, and felt something in his chest that he could not describe as anything except the most unreasonable and precisely deserved jealousy he had ever experienced. Emmeline looked up at Benedict with an expression that was warm and real and genuine, and Gideon thought, she looked at me like that once. In the first years. Before I gave her 11 years of kind, considerate, absolutely oblivious companionship and managed somehow to never once understand what was in front of me. He spent the rest of the party on the edge of the room, talking to people he could not remember afterward, watching Emmeline from the specific distance of a man who had arranged this outcome himself and was finding the consequences educational. 2 days later, she brought the separation papers to his study. She set them on the desk, and Gideon looked at them, and something in him that had been making arguments and counter-arguments and reasonable, managed assessments of the situation for the last 3 weeks simply stopped. I cannot sign these, he said. Emmeline stood across the desk from him. She was wearing grey, perfectly arranged, entirely composed. "They are in order," she said. "I had Mr. Fenwick review them. The terms are fair. That is not why I cannot sign them." She looked at him steadily. "Gideon." "You pulled your hand away." He stood. "At Alvingham, by the fire. You pulled your hand away, and you went to bed, and you have been," he moved around the desk, and she did not retreat but her chin came up, "you have been behind glass ever since, and I have been standing on the wrong side of it every morning for 3 weeks, and I need you to hear me." "I have heard you," she said. "You told me your heart belonged to another. I heard you clearly the first time. I was wrong." He said it without hedging, without the careful management of words that he used for everything. "I was wrong, Emmeline. I was so completely, catastrophically wrong that I genuinely do not have adequate language for how wrong I was." He stopped in front of her, close enough that he could see the steadiness she was maintaining and the cost of it. "Lady Sarah is a ghost. She was always a ghost, a 22-year-old girl that I held onto because she was uncomplicated and safe and required nothing of me but to be admired from a distance. Loving her was easy because she was never there." Emmeline said nothing. Her expression had not changed, but something behind it had shifted. "You were there," he said. "For 11 years, you were there. Every morning, and every dinner, and every crisis on that estate, and every ridiculous party, and every letter to the Home Office at 2 in the morning. His voice dropped. "You told me my taste in women was catastrophic, and you were right, and you were also describing yourself as an afterthought, and I let you, and I will regret that for a very long time." He reached out and took her by the waist, not with the polished ease of 1,000 public appearances, but with the directness of a man who has run out of performance and has only honesty left. "I was a fool trapped in a ghost story, Emmeline. My heart did not belong to Sarah. It was right here. With you. Being kept alive by you, all these years, and I was too blind and too stupid and too comfortable to see it." Emmeline looked at him. Her composure was still there, but it was thin now, translucent, and through it her eyes were very bright. "You cannot simply," she started. "I know," he said. "I know I cannot simply say it and have it be enough. I know what I did, and I know the weight of 11 years, and I am not asking you to forgive me in this room right now." He was holding her, and she had not moved away, and the separation papers were on the desk behind him, and none of it mattered except her face in front of his. "I am asking you to give me the chance to show you that I know what I have. Now that I finally know what I have." Her breath was unsteady. This was the most unsteady he had ever seen Emmeline, and it was the most honest she had ever looked, and he thought that he had been an absolute idiot for a very long time. She kissed him. Or he kissed her. Later, he was not entirely sure which of them had moved first, and it did not seem like a distinction that mattered. What mattered was that it was nothing like the polite, formal gestures of 11 years of public performance. It was desperate and real and 11 years overdue, and when they finally pulled apart they stood with their foreheads together in the quiet study, both breathing harder than was entirely dignified, and Gideon held on to her like a man who has understood, fully and finally, the value of what was almost lost. Chapter 5. He went to see Lady Sarah on a Tuesday morning. It was not a long conversation. He was direct, because he had learned recently the significant cost of not being direct, and he told her clearly and without cruelty that he had made a mistake, that his feelings had been based on memory rather than reality, and that he wished her happiness. Lady Sarah's response was not quiet. She was magnificent in her fury. Gideon could acknowledge this objectively, and she made several very pointed observations about his character, his title, and what she had sacrificed by returning to London on the basis of his implied attentions. He listened to all of it. He accepted it. And when it was finished, and she had swept from the room with the full theatrical force of a woman who had practiced this kind of exit, he sat for a moment in the empty drawing room of the borrowed townhouse and felt the very specific, clean feeling of a man who has finally stepped out of a story that was never about him. He felt lighter than he had in years. The social fallout was real and he accepted that too. The story moved through the season in the way these things moved, swiftly, and with embellishment, and with the particular gleeful attention of people who prefer other people's difficulties to their own. Gideon attended the necessary events with the composure of a man who had decided that the opinion of people who spoke about him over dinner was a price he was entirely willing to pay. He did not attend them alone. He arrived at Emmeline's sitting room the morning after his conversation with Lady Sarah, And he had the estate ledgers under his arm. There were always estate ledgers. This was the reality of what their life was made of, and she looked up from her correspondence and looked at the ledgers and looked at him with the careful, assessing look she used when she was deciding what something meant. He set the ledgers on her writing table. Inside the front cover of the first one, tucked between the pages, was a letter. He had written it the night before. He was not a man who found this kind of writing natural. His talent was for precision, for argument, for the organized presentation of evidence. What he had written was not organized. It was an honest accounting, in no particular order, of 11 years of small details that he had observed and understood too late. The way she remembered every tenant's name and the names of their children. The way she laughed when she was genuinely amused versus the way she laughed when she was being polite, and the considerable difference between the two. The way she had stayed up until 2 in the morning drafting letters that were not her legal obligation to draft. The way she had looked in the firelight at Alvingham Park with her sleeves rolled back and her attention entirely on the person in front of her. The way she had, every single morning for 11 years, made his life run better than it had any right to, and made it look like nothing, and had never once asked him to notice. He had written all of this. It was not elegant. It was, he thought, the most honest document he had ever produced. Emmeline read it slowly, without looking up at him. He waited. He was standing in front of her writing table like a man who had submitted the most important evidence of his career and was now simply at the mercy of the judge, which was, he reflected, an accurate description of the situation. She finished it. She looked at the last page for a moment. Then she looked up at him. Her expression was the one he had started to recognize, the one underneath the composure, where the real Emmeline lived. Her eyes were bright again, and her mouth had the particular quality it had in the moments just before she said something that was going to be both entirely true and perfectly timed. 11 years, she said. 11 years, he agreed. That is a very long time to wait for a letter, Gideon. I know. It is also, she said, setting the letter carefully on the desk as though it was something she intended to keep, a very long time to wait for a dance. You owe me approximately 570 dances, by my estimate. I will dance with you every evening for the rest of my life, he said, without hesitation, if you will allow me to start now. Emmeline stood. She looked at him, at the Duke of Alvingham, who was standing in her sitting room in the morning light, with no composure left and no performance remaining and only 11 years of finally understood love doing what it could with the material available. She crossed to him with the direct, unhurried certainty she brought to everything she had truly decided. You may start now, she said. Though I should warn you. I have 11 years of things to say to you that I have been keeping to myself, and I have absolutely no intention of keeping them to myself any longer. Good, Gideon said. I intend to listen to every one of them. He pulled her into his arms, not with the practiced ease of 11 years of public performance, but with the deliberate, grateful certainty of a man who had been given back something he had not deserved to get back, and intended to spend the rest of his life being worthy of it. She let herself be held, and she held him in return, and the sitting room was warm with the particular warmth of something that had been built slowly, without either of them entirely realizing it was being built, over 11 years of shared mornings and estate crises and terrible punch and dry humor murmured in crowded ballrooms. Outside, London carried on. The season would continue. There would be more dinner parties, and more letters to the Home Office, and more tenant correspondence, and more mornings in the library with the clock ticking and the tea going cold. Only now, Emmeline thought, she would not be listening to the clock. She would be listening to Gideon. And Gideon, who was holding her with both arms and no intention of letting go, had every reason to believe she would finally have something worth hearing. 11 years, he said, quietly, into her hair. And I almost signed those papers. You did not sign them, she said. No. Then, Emmeline said, with the dry precision that had been the private grammar of their marriage for 11 years and would, she intended, be the grammar of it for a great many more, we will say no more about it. And they didn't. Or not immediately. There were other things, more pressing, that required both of their attention. The estate, and the season, and 570 overdue dances, and 11 years of honest things finally finding their way out into the light where they had always belonged. Gideon chased a phantom from his past, only to realize his true love was the woman who had stood by his side for 11 years. If you were Emmeline, would you have believed his sudden realization, Or would you have made the Duke court you for another 11 years first? Let me know in the comments below.